Good morning. Welcome to English Mirror. Today, we analyze the introduction to the theoretical work Orientalism. Orientalism is a 1978 book by Edward Said, in which the author establishes the eponymous term Orientalism as a critical concept to describe the West's common contemptuous depiction and portrayal of the East, that is, the Orient. Let's look at the text. Edward Said begins Orientalism by explaining how Orientalism is defined within three different contexts. Academically, the term refers to the act of studying or otherwise engaging with the Orient. In a more informal context, Orientalism is a way of thinking about the Orient when contrasted with the Occident, the West. Finally, Said evokes Michel Foucault's concept of discourse to describe how historically Orientalism is a specifically Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. He states his goal in writing Orientalism is to describe how the concept of Orientalism was constructed historically to serve French and British imperialist agendas, and how Orientalism is constructed today. His focus is on describing the framework for the creation and perpetuation of the concept of Orientalism. After defining Orientalism and laying out his thesis, Said moves to a discussion of the assumptions behind his work. He clarifies that while the concept of Orientalism is constructed, the Orient itself is in fact a real location. While Orientalism is a construct, it has very real consequences for the Orient and is not easily subject to change because of hegemony, that condition when certain cultural forms predominate over others. The introduction attempts to define the term Orientalism, contextualize the work, and lay out the inherent biases of the author. Said claims his work is primarily a humanistic text and uses anthropological methodology to formulate his argument. In his definitions of Orientalism, Said makes clear that the concept is a construct or a framework of thinking created by outside agents. Said claims Orientalism has been created through the domination of one culture, the Occident, over another, the Orient. In describing his biases, Said is practicing academically sound anthropology. One of the tenets of cultural anthropology is cultural relativism, or the idea that when considered within the context of their own culture, all actions by a particular group are morally equivocal. Now, let's analyze the major points in the text. The Orient was almost a European invention and had been since antiquity a place of romance, exotic beings, haunting memories, and landscapes, remarkable experiences. Now it was disappearing. In a sense, it had happened, its time was over. The main thing for the European visitor was a European representation of the Orient and its contemporary fate. The Orient is not only adjacent to Europe, it is also the place of Europe's greatest and richest and oldest colonies, the source of its civilizations and languages, its cultural contestant, and one of its deepest and most recurring images of the other. In addition, the Orient has helped to define Europe or the West as its contrasting image, idea, personality, experience. Yet, none of this Orient is merely imaginative. The Orient is an integral of European material civilization and culture. Orientalism expresses and represents that part culturally and even ideologically as a mode of discourse with supporting institutions, vocabulary, scholarship, imagery, doctrines, even colonial bureaucracies and colonial styles. The most readily accepted designation for Orientalism is an academic one, and indeed, the label still serves in a number of academic institutions. Anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient, and this applies whether the person is an anthropologist, sociologist, historian, or philologist, either in its specific or its general aspects, is an Orientalist. And what he or she does is Orientalism. The point is that even if it does not survive as it once did, Orientalism lives on academically through its doctrines and theses about the Orient and the Oriental. Secondly, Orientalism is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. Thus, a very large mass of writers, among whom are poets, novelists, philosophers, political theorists, economists, and imperial administrators, have accepted the basic distinction between East and West as the starting point for elaborate theories, epics, novels, social descriptions, and political accounts concerning the Orient, its people, customs, mind, destiny, and so on. The third meaning of Orientalism, which is something more historically and materially defined than either of the other two. Taking the late 18th century as a very roughly defined starting point, Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Foucault's notion of a discourse, as described by him in The Archaeology of Knowledge and in Discipline and Punish, to identify Orientalism. My contention is that without examining Orientalism as a discourse, one cannot possibly understand the enormously systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment period. This is not to say that Orientalism unilaterally determines what can be said about the Orient, but that it is a whole network of interests inevitably brought to bear on any occasion when that peculiar entity, the Orient, is in question. How this happens is what this book tries to demonstrate. To speak of Orientalism, therefore, is to speak mainly, although not exclusively, of a British and French cultural enterprise, a project whose dimensions take in such disparate realms as the imagination itself, the whole of India and the Levant, the biblical texts and the biblical lands, the spice trade, colonial armies, and many more. My point is that Orientalism derives from a particular closeness experienced between Britain and France and the Orient, which until the early 19th century had really meant only India and the Bible lands. The beginning of the 19th century until the end of World War II, France and Britain dominated the Orient and Orientalism. Since World War II, America has dominated the Orient and approaches it as France and Britain once did. Part 2. Vickers' great observation that men make their own history, that what they can know is what they have made, and extend it to geography, as both geographical and cultural entities, to say nothing of historical entities, such locales, regions, geographical sectors as Orient and Occident are man-made. Having said that, one must go on to state a number of reasonable qualifications. In the first place, it would be wrong to conclude that the Orient was essentially an idea or a creation with no corresponding reality. A second qualification is that ideas, cultures, and histories cannot seriously be understood or studied without their force, or more precisely, their configurations of power also being studied. The relationship between Occident and Orient is a relationship of power, of domination, of varying degrees of a complex hegemony, and is quite accurately indicated in the title of K.M. Panikar's Classic Asia and Western Dominance. The third qualification is like this. One ought never to assume that the structure of Orientalism is nothing more than a structure of lies or of myths, which were the truth about them to be told would simply blow away. Orientalism, therefore, is not an airy European fantasy about the Orient, but a created body of theory and practice in which, for many reasons, there has been a considerable material investment. Continued investment made Orientalism as a system of knowledge about the Orient, an accepted grid for filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness. Gramsci has made the useful analytic distinction between civil and political society, in which the former is made up of voluntary affiliations like schools, families, and unions, the latter of state institutions such as the army, the police, the central bureaucracy, whose role in the polity is direct domination. Culture, of course, is to be found operating within civil society, where the influence of ideas, of institutions, and of other persons works not through domination but by what Gramsci calls consent. In any society not totalitarian, then certain cultural forms predominate over others, just as certain ideas are more influential than others. The form of this cultural leadership is what Gramsci has identified as hegemony, an indispensable concept for any understanding of cultural life in the industrial West. It is hegemony, or rather the result of cultural hegemony at work, that gives Orientalism the durability and the strength I have been speaking about so far. Orientalism is never far from what Denys has called the idea of Europe, a collective notion identifying us Europeans as against all those non-Europeans, and indeed it can be argued that the major component in European culture is precisely what made that culture hegemonic both in and outside Europe. The idea of European identity as a superior one in comparison with all the non-European peoples and cultures. There is in addition the hegemony of European ideas about the Orient, themselves reiterating European superiority over Oriental backwardness, usually overriding the possibility that the more independent or more skeptical thinker might have heard different views on the matter. Part 3. I mentioned three aspects of my contemporary reality. First one is the distinction between pure and political knowledge. It is very easy to argue that knowledge about Shakespeare or Wordsworth is not political, whereas knowledge about contemporary China or the Soviet Union is. One reason for saying that a humanist who writes about Wordsworth or an editor whose specialty is Keats is not involved in anything political is that what he does seems to have no direct political effect upon reality in the everyday sense. Knowledge is not therefore automatically non-political. What I am interested in doing now is suggesting how the general liberal consensus that true knowledge is fundamentally non-political obscures the highly, if obscurely organized, political obtaining when knowledge is produced. We may say first that civil society recognizes a gradation of political importance in the various fields of knowledge. To some extent, the political importance given a field comes from the possibility of its direct translation into economic terms. European and then American interest in the Orient was political, according to some of the obvious historical accounts of it, and it was the culture that created that interest, that acted dynamically along with brute political, economic, and military rationales to make the Orient the varied and complicated place. Orientalism is not a mere political subject matter or field that is reflected passively by culture, scholarship, or institutions. Nor is it a large and diffuse collection of texts about the Orient. Nor is it representative and expressive of some nefarious Western imperialist plot to hold down the Oriental world. Orientalism is a cultural and a political fact. Therefore, I study Orientalism as a dynamic exchange between individual authors and the large political concerns shaped by the three great empires, British, French, American, in whose intellectual and imaginative territory the writing was produced. The kind of political questions raised by Orientalism then are as follows. What other sorts of intellectual, aesthetic, scholarly, and cultural energies went into the making of an imperialist tradition like the Orientalist one? The methodological question. My starting point, therefore, has been the British, French, and American experience of the Orient taken as a unit. What made that experience possible by way of historical and intellectual background, what the quality and character of the experience has been. My principal methodological devices for studying authority here are what can be called strategic location, which is a way of describing the author's position in a text with regard to the Oriental material he writes about, and strategic formation, which is a way of analyzing the relationship between texts and the way in which groups of texts, types of texts, even textual genres acquire mass, density, and referential power among themselves and thereafter in the culture at large. Third one, the personal dimension. In the Prison Notebooks, Gramsci says, the starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical process to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. Yet what German Orientalism had in common with Anglo-French and later American Orientalism was a kind of intellectual authority over the Orient within Western culture. The first designation Said uses for the topic is the academic interpretation. He lends this to the field of work of anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient. This definition is generally too indistinct as compared to the introductory designation. Although it incorporates the multiple discourses of knowledge, it fails to distinguish the Orient as existing comparatively instead of just being the subject of examination. The second definition draws attention to this distinction and clarifies Orientalism while also extending its breadth to all that is not considered West. Said notes that there has been a fair amount of interchange over the last few centuries over these two theoretical fields of coming to terms with the Orient. He then lists his findings about the recent history of the Orient's relationship with the West. Said suggests that the balance of power from Franco-British involvement to a largely American involvement has not had so great an effect Orientalism as would be expected. According to Gramsci, a political society is one in which the citizen is directly dominated and imposed on by the state, who create and maintain the social institutions. Civil society, however, is made up of citizens voluntarily affiliating themselves with certain social responsibilities. It is this societal happening that he calls hegemony, which Said explains is a phenomenon that necessitates interest in cultural otherness such as Orientalism. After listing the aspects of his contemporary reality, Said discusses and attempts to address three realities that would bring the puzzle of Orientalism closer to a solution. Said uses devices to examine the authority that is descriptive of the West's relationship with the Orient. The first device is strategic location, which describes an author's position in his study with regard to the Orient. Strategic formation, the second device, incorporates the study of the Orient and the way in which different intellectual standpoints gain acceptance and credibility. The intellectual basis of their position is composed of referential knowledge that relates to other works. Thank you for watching this video. If you like the video, please share and subscribe.